All right, welcome to IELTS Speaking for Dummies. This is part 1 of 1, introduction and interview, right? The part 1 portion of IELTS Speaking. So let's get right into it. Now, in the beginning of the IELTS Speaking, you will have a few things that you need to do, right? The first things that will happen in the IELTS session would be introduction phase. Here you will see the examiner, right? You will smile at the examiner, right? You will greet the examiner, right? You both will greet each other. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatnot. You introduce your name to the examiner, right? The examiner will tell you what's his name, and then he will ask you for your name, and then he will ask you for some document check. In other words, he will ask you for your passport or identity card, right? So this is the bit which we call the introduction. Next, immediately after that, the examiner will start to ask you a question. Now, this is a ice-breaking question just to get you to warm up, all right? So the examiner would ask something like, let's talk about where you live, whether you live in the city or in the countryside, what you like about the place that you live in, and have you lived there for a very long time, right? So the examiner will ask one of these 3 questions. So the examiner might ask you something about where you live, or the examiner would ask you about whether you are working, right? Examiner might even ask you whether you're studying, okay? So based on what you tell the examiner, then the examiner will ask you 1 or 2 more questions. This is the beginning phase, right? So if the examiner were to ask you a question which is, do you work or do you study? Then if you study, you will tell the examiner you do study, and then the examiner will ask you common questions like, what do you study? Why do you enjoy studying these subjects? Which do you think is more important? When you're studying, is it your teachers or students themselves? So this part will be very fast, okay? The examiner here is really not looking for any specific information from you, but he's really trying to get a sense, right, about what your speaking standard is. So he's getting a sense of it, right? So you should not worry too much on this part. And in this section, do not spend too much time trying to impress the examiner, right? So next, the next part will be 2 additional topics that the examiner will ask you, okay? The question is, what are these 2 additional topics, okay? What do you think these additional topics might be, okay? So after you introduce a little bit about yourself, the examiner will ask you 2 additional topics in part 1, okay? This topic can be anything, which is general. Topics like, for example, music, right? Examiner could ask you something about music. Let me type it out here, okay? The examiner could ask you topics about music. That's a very general topic. Examiner could ask you something about whether you like tea or coffee, right? Why do you like tea and coffee? Which one do you prefer? Which is more popular? And things like music, as I mentioned earlier, what music do you like? Do you usually listen to music? Or do you always listen to music with other people? Or you prefer to listen to music by yourself? And then there are also questions that examiners might ask, silly things that, very simple things like, do you enjoy walking, right? Where do you walk? How often do you walk? Do you think walking is a good form of exercise? Examiner might even ask you things about friendships, right? Do you think you're a good friend? What do you think is the most valuable thing about friends? Here, you will notice, right, the examiner will not be in conversation with you. The examiner will not be, right? in conversation with you. What do I mean by that? Here, the examiner is simply asking you a question. Okay, guys? The examiner is simply asking you a question and expect an answer. It's a Q&A, right? It's really an interview. What does that mean? It's one-sided, guys. It's just one-sided, right? So you can't be asking the examiner, well, what about you? Do you like coffee too? The examiner will not answer the question, all right? Because in part one is essentially interview. It's one direction. Examiner asks a question, he smiles, and then you reply as best as you can, okay? So this is what's happening. So for one topic, right, guys, for one topic, for example, a topic about music, the examiner is gonna ask you 3 to 4 questions about music. Now, it will be not more than 4 questions, right? So that's for one topic. Then, of course, the examiner will try to get you to talk about another topic, which is maybe perhaps about tea or coffee, right? This is probably topic number 2. Again, the examiner will be asking 3 to 4 questions about tea or coffee, right? So in total, the examiner can ask you a maximum of 8 questions from these 2 additional topics, right? And usually the examiner will ask you something like 4 to 6 questions if there is not enough time. Remember, guys, in the first part of this IELTS speaking, the examiner needs to finish, right? Talking to you for about 4 to 5 minutes, right? So that's about as much time as the examiner is going to spend on this section, okay? So if you have other questions, let's move on to part 2 in the next video. For part 2, subscribe and see you soon.